Yes, hello and welcome. And I think Tom, you're going to have a little look at the chat for me, aren't you, for a little bit? Because we're just going to
Yes, I'll do
have
that.
a wander through some. I thought I'd share a little bit of content with you by way, hopefully, of stimulating some discussion. It's nice to see some familiar faces here in the chat. So do introduce yourself so that other people can engage and talk to you as well. So anyway, just to move, I'm going to ask you in a moment to do some technical shenanigans as well. I'm going to ask you to join me in Mentimeter, but before I do that, hopefully everybody can see my screen. Tom, is that looking all right?
To me.
Lovely. Okay, good. So now what indeed? And you'll excuse my slightly watery picture of a woman staring at a crystal ball, because I suppose in some senses I want to share some hot off the press information that we're getting from the public about their attitudes towards digital engagement at the moment. But of course, we can but speculate about how long any of this stuff will last. I'm hoping that that's what we can have a conversation about altogether. So I'm just going to give you just a very quick intro to the audience agency, particularly because I just want to point out what resources and sources I'm referring to. And then, as I say, I'm going to share a few insights in an interactive manner, and hopefully we can have a conversation about what we should do about any of these things, if anything. Just to say, so Audience Agency, National Charity for Cultural Engagement and Participation. We work across arts, heritage, culture. We do a lot of audience, visitor, public and sector research. We're very well known for doing this large quantitative piece of work where we extract data from about 1,000 organisations, but we also do a lot of qualitative work as well. And we also spend a lot of time working with organisations and consortia, thinking about their engagement strategy, about their audience strategy, about their public involvement strategies. And we're very interested in taking a user-centred approach to the ways in which we do that. So that's us. As I say, we run a thing called Audience Finder, funded by Creative Scotland, Arts Council Wales and Arts Council England, whereby we extract data in two forms from lots of organisations. We've got around about, I think it's something like 19 million out of the 23 million households in the UK are tracked within Audience Finder. So it gives us a very good picture of who's engaging with arts, culture, museums, particularly in the funded sector, but not exclusively, also some commercials in there as well. And it tells us, where people are doing lots of different things, where they only do one thing. It gives us a very good national picture of what's going on. Broadly speaking, we stick survey data and ticketing data in there. We mash it all up, stick some audience profiling information in there, mapping, and then it spits out the other end and gives organisations a personalised dashboard for their organisation, whereby they can see, they can compare themselves with the benchmarks for other organisations. And I think, as I say, it gives a really good idea of the map of cultural engagement. So just for those of you who don't know, an important layer, displaying horribly in Mentimeter, I should say, an important layer within Audience Finder are these 10 population segments which relate very specifically to how people engage with culture. We have these sort of highly engaged groups in orange there, experience seekers, metroculturals and commuter land culture buffs. So these are the kind of audiences that really dominate, that dominate most publicly supported arts engagement, and indeed quite a lot of commercials as well. And we have these sort of middle engaged groups, interested, don't do anything like as many, don't attend and engage or visit as frequently, but still interested in a sort of more passing kind of way sometimes. And then the less engaged groups, definitely doing lots of culture and creative things, but not necessarily as often in those publicly supported institutions, perhaps more sort of DIY stuff, more community oriented in some cases, just a little bit less interested in sort of certainly institutional culture. We hold a database of all households in the UK, and they're all tagged with one of these groupings. And as I say, it is a very useful predictor of people's likely preferences around culture and engagement. I mention it because it is relevant to what I want to talk about in a moment. So since March, we've been working like mad at the Audience Agency to gather together the information we have in Audience Finder to relate what we're knowing about changes in audience behaviour, particularly to the audience spectrum groups, trying to give people a bit of a filter. So if you know that a lot of your audience are in the experience seeker group, for example, the news is good because we're seeing lots of interesting interest from that group around different forms of digital engagement. If you, on the other hand, you have lots of commuter lane culture buffs in your group, you'll be in your audience rather, you'll be a little bit concerned because actually they're the people most likely to be shielding and staying at home, you know, or at least looking after their elderly parents and so on. So audience spectrum, a really important filter that we're looking at our audiences through. But very importantly, what I'm mostly going to be talking about today are two of the really specific new data sets that we have. We've just got the very first results back from a large-scale monitor of the population through COVID, telling us about their cultural interests. And we've also been doing a survey of digital audiences, and I'll come on to those in a moment. But we've also been looking at an audience intention survey in Scotland, and we've got lots of new resources helping organisations to use some of this information. But without more ado, let's just move on just to think. So particularly these two data sources we're looking at the moment, the COVID population monitor, it's a representative sample of the whole UK population. So it's giving us a really good sense of how everybody is responding in terms of their cultural preferences through lockdown and out the other side. A lot of the survey data we've been able to look at so far is telling us quite specifically about super engagers, about audiences who do a lot. So lots of people have been mailing their mailing lists and so on. And of course, that's been very, very useful information about who's coming back and so on. This gives us another dimension because we're able to compare a lot of those things with what the wider population are up to. As I say, so it's giving us a good picture of what non-engagers all the way up to super engagers, or all the way down or across to them alike. It's giving us lots of information about different demographic groups in a very representative and reliable way. And most importantly, and I hope interestingly for you guys today, is that it's longitudinal. So we've just got the first wave back now, but actually we'll be able to explore certain themes in much more depth as we go on. And I'd love to hear from you about what you think is important. So that's really telling us about how people in general are feeling about culture right now. And today I'm going to be thinking about how they're using digital and for what. And then we've also been surveying through embedded links in people's digital content, their online content at the moment. About 200 organisations have run a particular survey which is looking at how people are responding to the content that they've got up at the moment. That's a free to participate in survey. Come this way if you're not already joining it, because it's a really important source of information telling us who our digital audiences are, be able to compare that information directly with information about our physical audiences through Audience Finder, and then looking at behaviour and motivations of those digital audiences. So these are the sources that I'm going to be drawing on. You can grab hold of all of them on our website. The links are all over the place, and I think somewhere Tom might be able to put them in the chat for you. Just to say, by the way, that the COVID population monitor is part of the COVID-19 Impact Project, which is being coordinated by the Centre for Cultural Value at the University of Leeds, of which I'm also co-director. And that's a project funded by HLC and in partnership with the PEC, the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. So just to get the proper credits there. So it is part of a wider study, and we'll be looking at this data in relation to things like employment, the cultural ecosystem, as well as in isolation, just about audiences. So I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I suppose I want to think, what are the questions that we are asking ourselves about digital engagement at the moment? And I suppose in my head, they look a bit like this. And as I say, I'd love to hear from you if this doesn't look quite right. So, is new digital content creating new access or new barriers, or a bit of both? And if so, for whom? What features are actually working? What new business models could emerge? And how should we respond to what we're learning about audiences at the moment? So those are the questions that I'm kind of toying with, if you like. And I just wanted to share some very early findings from our work about some of these things, because obviously the crucial thing is there's what's happening now, and I guess there's particularly what's going to stick in future. And that's what I suppose we're deeply thinking about at the moment, and I'm sure you are too. So now, in order to participate with this, what I would really, really like you to do is if you could just come out of your browser for Hopin and open a new tab in Chrome, and then if you could go to mentimeter.com. And Tom, I don't know if you could put in the chat this code number that you need to put in. So I'm asking everybody on this call, please, it's a leap of faith now in this session, if you could open mentimeter.com, because we're going to look at some of the results through a polling method, which is much more fun, I promise you. Tom, how's that looking? Can everybody see? Everybody go to Mentimeter, okay?
Yes, I think it's actually, is it not called menti.com?
Menti.com, yes, sorry. The name of the website you're looking for is menti.com. And then let's put here in the chat, it's, lovely. Somebody's voting there. That's what I like to see.
I've already found it. Do you want to give me the code and I'll put it into the chat?
Yeah. So the code is 7873. You need to put these numbers in separately. 78, 73, 75, and 5. You've done it. Lovely. Thanks, Tom. So I'm looking for a sample of 26 people to respond to this. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to see if you can find it. So approximately how many people in the UK have engaged with online culture? This doesn't include TV and Netflix since March. And I'll give you 3 guesses, around about 5 million, around about 12, or around about 18 million. What do you reckon? I'm going to wait till a few of you have had a go, because there's a few of these coming up, so it's worth finding. This is not a one-off. Quite a lot of what we're going to go through now invites you to Menti. If you're struggling to do it on your browser as well, you can do it on your phone very easily as well. Again, just go to menti.com rather, menti.com, and put that number in. Any more for any more? Fortunately, you can't be named and shamed, so if you get anything wildly wrong, it's fine. And the 7 of you who aren't saying, oh, what is the code? Somebody says here, Asta, yes, it's Menti, so it's MENTI.com, and the code you have to put in is 78. Sorry, everybody else, we'll just wait for a few people, but then once we're off, we're away. 75 and then a 5. There we go. Asta, you're in, lovely. Okay, so let's go with the sample of you who are there. You can join at any point. So approximately how many people have engaged with online culture since March? So we asked incidentally across a huge range of different kinds of activities, but this is just a very brief summary. And the correct answer is, in fact, thank you for those extra votes there. The correct answer is, in fact, 18 million. So it's 17.8, I think, million people, according to the sampling that we've done, have actually engaged with one of these forms of culture since March. So, you know, it's around about, it's not perhaps as many of the population. The sense, if you listen to people talking about it, is that there's a vast, huge numbers of the population are engaging. It's not everybody by any means, but actually it's about 18 million, which is, you know, a pretty, you know, it's a significant number of people, and quite a lot of those people are saying that they've done it for the first time. So moving on, for fun, bear with me. So what do you think about this one? How many more people engaged with online culture in the 12 months before lockdown or since? So do you think more people have been doing online culture stuff since lockdown, or was it in fact or more in the 12 months before? And I now know 19 of you can vote, so I'm going to wait. Okay, so well done. Thank you, everybody. Well, rather interestingly, it's not. And I think this is something that we need to get our heads around. So although quite a lot of new people have gone and done some online stuff, in fact, the numbers are quite, I mean, it's largely, you know, it's quite often, it's quite a lot to do with the function of time. So this is surveying just around about now. So this is actually in 6 months, but it turns out that in fact people have done significantly more in the 12 months before, or significantly more people had done some kind of online culture in the long list that we gave them in the 12 months before lockdown than they have since. So that's what that's suggesting, is that there's not been a huge increase in the number of people that are doing things. There's a small increase in how much stuff those people who are already doing it have done, and there has just definitely been an increase among people who consider themselves to be in-person engagers. But overall, in fact, there were more people said that they did things in the 12 months before lockdown than they have done since. So moving on, Which has seen a greater level of new or online engagement? Has it been for performing arts stuff or for museums and galleries? So that's my next question to you. I like it. I have to say there's like temptation to act like a sports commentator during this and sort of just to keep gabbling and introducing interesting bits of information. I would do my best not to gabble complete nonsense. Interesting, yes. Again, it's much fun in Menti.com. You can actually segment people by which sector they work in. But in fact, I haven't done that, so I don't know where you're coming from in this. But in fact, that's quite right. The 11 of you were quite correct that performing arts has seen a much greater increase of new online engagement. Museums and galleries, it's actually been, in fact, if the stats are to be believed, and we've asked the question the right way, people are doing slightly less engagement with museums and galleries online than they were doing before. Quite a lot less than they were doing before. Whereas performing arts, actually, there's been a surge in certain places. So we're seeing quite a difference then. You might like to just have a look at. The writing's very small. My apologies, but actually these are the types of digital content that most people have accessed. So of all the people that said they did things, it looks a bit like this. So of all the people that said they'd done online things, 81% of them had watched a full-length production. I just leave you to dwell on that a little bit. I mean, I think this is more reflecting what's actually been available than it necessarily is what people's preferences are, of course. Moving on, stay with Menti for a minute. So has new digital content reached less engaged people? Just going back to my talking about those segments where we sort of look at the whole population and then sort of assign people into one of these different groups based on their propensity to engage with things. So thinking about this sort of so-called less engaged people, do you think new digital content has reached more less engaged people than in-person opportunities ever did? Slightly tricky wording, terrible question design. My research colleagues would be appalled, but bear with it. Well, notice I'm not giving you the don't know option here. Interesting. Balance of views here. This is quite an interesting one. I think it would depend a lot who you ask. Yeah. Well, interestingly, it's no, and I think there's been quite a lot of discussion about whether, because online content obviously faces down some of those issues to do with lots of people in the country living a long way away from cultural opportunities. In fact, it looks as though and that's often the places in which the less engaged community lives. But actually, it turns out that if anything, online, it is skewing a lot towards people who are already reasonably well engaged. So in fact, at the moment, the cultural opportunities that are out there online for the time being seem to be driving, creating even more of a kind of cultural engagement gap than we had before. Now that's interesting because we've got lots of pockets of practice and areas where we can see that done in the right way, there's quite an appetite for online engagement among less engaged groups. And we've seen it with the Creative People and Places Network, which is a lot of projects that work very specifically with people in those less engaged groups. And they've had some huge hits and successes. Have a look at the case studies on their website, where actually online has really, really served to break down barriers. But actually, overall in the population, it's not having that effect. So it's sort of suggesting that we need to really think about doing some things in rather a niche way. But this is an interesting question, isn't it? So how has new digital content then attracted a more or less ethnically diverse public than in person? And when I say ethnically diverse, I'm specifically using the census categories of Black and Asian broad groups, because those are the ones that we're able to test against the population figures. So what do you think? Do you think the same sort of levelling up? What have we seen in terms of digital content and cultural diversity? Has that made any difference? Well, I think that's a statistically robust response there. That's a kind of, so about the same or less diverse, but only 2 people think it's moved more diverse. Well, this is one of the really fascinating figures that have jumped out of this first wave of information for us, because in fact, it actually, apparently, digital content seems to be attracting a significantly more diverse audience than in-person activity has done. I mean, by several percent. Thank you very much, that person. I love that when that happens. Add it later. Join that group. So we're really lots of questions arising about this. I mean, obviously, there's a bit of a knee-jerk assumption that this might be to do with the fact that there are barriers that we may or may not be aware of in our venues and so on. It may also be reflecting the fact that we're seeing quite a lot more bias towards digital engagement in certain other groups as well. So it may be an issue of intersectionality, which I'll come on to in a moment. So, have new digital opportunities created better access for disabled people, however? What do you think about that one? I would love to know if it's always the first person, if number 1 is always the first person or not. Whether some of you are great, brilliant. More disabled people using digital than in person, less disabled people, about the same. Now, this is a really interesting one because actually it looks as though different studies are telling us significantly different things. So when we survey audiences, so when we're looking at that digital audience survey, some of the other surveying that's happened, like the Act 2 survey from Indigo, which we've had doing a lot of work around the digital side of that. It looks as though when we talk to audiences that considerably more disabled audience members are using online stuff than they would have been doing in person. So what that's suggesting is that if you're already a disabled audience member, you're doing more stuff, definitely doing more stuff online. But over the population study, it looks much flatter. It doesn't look as though more disabled people are therefore taking part. So it's more of an effect that disabled people who are already interested are able to do more. But the difference there is quite significant. So there's something obviously really positive, very positive indications here, again, about digital reaching many more interested disabled people who want to engage with arts and culture. So something really positive here to build on. Okay, next one. So who most agrees with this interesting statement? I am engaging with arts and culture online to reduce feelings of stress and anxiety, which is something we've been asking in the digital audience survey. So what do you reckon? I've got 3 significant groups here: the highly engaged retirees, under 24s, or less culturally engaged people, so that less engaged group again. How would you rank them? Who do you think is most likely to agree with that statement? It takes a bit of thinking about these ranking ones, don't they? Brilliant. I see you've all got it. Super. "17, are you coming in or not?" Anyway, right, great, thank you. So, not interesting guess there. So actually, 60% of under 24s, 60%, which I find a shockingly huge number, 60% of the under 24s we asked this question of said that they were engaging with arts and culture to reduce feelings of stress and anxiety. So they were the top group. But very interestingly, 50% in that less culturally engaged group also said the same thing. Whereas our sort of, core audience for a certain kind of cultural activity, not everything by a long way, but particularly concert goers, theatre goers, and so on. But that highly engaged retirees, only 25% of them said that. So it's a kind of real difference by age and demography about how likely you are to sort of think about, doing arts and culture as a way of sort of reducing feelings of stress. Now, of course, that may relate a lot to the idea of who's feeling most stressed and anxious, but actually, we know that those highly engaged retirees are often people who are quite anxious about COVID, but actually this idea that you might go and do things online to sort of just, distract yourself and think about other things is quite important here. And actually, really interestingly, also that less engaged group also were the ones who said that a lot of people in that group also said that doing arts and culture stuff was really was important to their well-being as well. So I think this is an interesting mix. We can see that actually we're opening up the gap between who's actually accessing cultural stuff online and in person. It's not actually really helping us with that less engaged group, and yet it's something that people think is very important. I think it's something to dwell on. Okay, we're getting to the end now. You'll be glad to know, those of you who are not in particularly enjoying voting. But anyway, which factors do people most like about stream content? Is it free or low because it's free or lower cost? Is it because it's more accessible, you don't have to travel? Is it because I can do it when I want to? Or is it because I can save on other costs like travel and childcare? Can you rank those according to what people actually told us were the most important features for them? What do you think is in number one? It's actually some other in this category, and as I say, the results. The survey itself is very long, so all the results are not. We haven't made them all accessible at the moment, but we're going to be doing some deep dives of all of the research. But in fact, we very quickly got a summary up online, and I do encourage you to go and have a look at our website and get the full results. I think we've got the link there for you. But actually in our summary, you'll see some other really interesting things come to the forefront here. But these were the 4 most important things. And I think that you've got that spot on. So in fact, first was indeed, I can do it when I want to. More accessible, don't have to travel was the second most important thing. And then the thing about cost was actually the third. The third and fourth, I think that's right. They were in that order. I think something like 35% of people said the most important thing for them was that they could do it when they wanted to. And in fact, it was the thing that everybody mentioned as also very important. So there was one question about how important doing things live at the same time as, being aware that other people watching at the same time did feature on there. But the overwhelming important concept was the on-demand one. And I don't know whether that sort of feels obvious, but in a way, it certainly feels as though, certainly when it comes to streaming, we've been quite concerned. This, obviously, if you're a museum, this is less relevant. But for performing arts, I think there's been a thing about trying to do things in the live space that the sense that you're it's a one-off and that kind of feeling. But I think it's interesting that is. That is a little contrary to what people are saying they're actually interested in. Again, really interesting to have a look at a bit more at those figures, and we'll be doing some more deep diving around that. So let's have a look. So here's the big killer one, of course, though. What percentage of people are willing to pay for online culture? So we asked this question, we asked in quite a lot of different ways, and this is an aggregation of it. So what would you guess? Was it 27% of people, 52 or 84? Now, don't forget, there have been quite a lot of the studies of existing audiences. We've asked people what they think about it. This is across the overall population, and we're able to cut this down by things like age, by demographics, and so on. So I would say I won't share this here, and we'll be doing some more on that, but it will be interesting to find out. But what do you think overall? As a total percentage of the population, what percentage of people are willing to pay for online culture? We're divided on this one. Can I ask any last voters if they'd like to just join in there? Interestingly, okay, so it's actually, thank you, just leveling up there. Well, you were right, that last person to vote there, because it is actually 27%. So it's quite a low number. I think some of the, lots of people have talked about being interested in doing more, but willing to pay, it's quite a low number. And I think we asked people around whether that was through memberships and subscriptions, one-offs, pay what you can, but the total number was 27%. So it is quite challenging in terms of how we're going to find those emerging business models. However, I think there are lots of suggestions about what might fly. When you dig down and ask different kinds of people what they think, however, you get some quite interesting light and shade. So definitely the payment models for different kinds of audiences may be very different. And actually one of the most interesting factors, because I was very surprised by this, is that the younger audiences are, the more likely they are to say they would be willing to pay for online culture, which is, I thought that was very interesting, because it feels as though that's a generation that have grown up expecting things to be free and online. And in fact, they're the least resistant to the idea of paying for online culture. Okay. So, which audiences most appreciate digital-first content? And I'm sorry, this is a very clumsy question, but I wanted to get it in here because it's a super important question. So when I talk about digital-first, I mean, you know, things, we asked a lot of categories about things that were made to be in the digital space rather than just streaming content, for example. So I've made up some sort of 3 slightly clumsy segments, if you like. So super engagers, under 34s, regular attenders, and less engaged audiences. Who most appreciates digital-first content? Yeah, not a beautifully crafted question, let's be honest, but, you know, making a point, really. I think, yeah. Okay, well, I think that, thank you, 16, 17. Interesting one here. I think that's right. In fact, I think it's neck and neck, really, with super engagers. So certainly among a particular kind of, the kind of audiences that are the real mainstay of most contemporary art forms, so that'll be contemporary dance, it's certain contemporary visual arts and so on. Those audiences align very, very closely with this group of people that are saying they prefer digital first content. Skews very, very heavily towards younger audiences, but also older super engagers, usually metropolitan. It will be those, I mean, it sounds horrible to say, but the definition of that metroculturals group that I pointed out is that they nearly all have at least 2 HE qualifications, so it definitely skews to do with education and or youth, which is really interesting, I think. But actually some quite sort of strong views coming out in the literals about what people are saying about those things as well. Okay, so here we're getting the nub of the question then. So this is really a question just about your opinion. There is some, well, there are some stats, but it's a lesser what do you think about the stats, it's more what do you think. So do you think that more people will engage with digital content in future? I mean, this is one of the crystal ball gazing moments, isn't it? Because we can't really know. We know what people say, but people are notoriously bad at answering. I mean, questionnaires which ask people what they're going to do in future are, you know, notoriously unreliable, unfortunately. And that's not just in elections. So, do you think more people engage to do it? So lots of optimists. That's what I like to see. And it is. I think this is the. Obviously, the interesting part of this is if so, how, what, and when. And we'll come. I'm going to stop doing this silly polling in a moment, and perhaps we can come on to that question. Yes. So, 17. I've lost you, but anyway, I mean, I think there is I certainly notice among my colleagues that there's a huge enthusiasm and a kind of optimism, particularly those of us who, I guess, have a particular interest in digital content. I guess there is a sense that there's going to be a sea change, that something radical will have shifted. Certainly the figures are telling us this is rather interesting, I think. So slightly complex graph, stay with it for a moment. I promised, I think, I can't remember if I promised not to, but anyway, I've tried not to bombard you with too many flat graphs like this, but interesting continuing online engagement by previous online engagement. So in that first group, those are people saying, you know, the first and second blocks are people who are either very interested or possibly interested. So you can see in the no not interested grouping, you know, by and large, that's quite a small group, in fact, of people who put off. And you know, the big spike there is really people who are not particularly, they just don't like doing things online in general. They haven't done it before or after, they haven't tried it. So, you know, what you're getting there is large numbers of people suggesting that they are going to, you know, they are going to be interested in doing it. I think overall, something that adds up to something like 87% of respondents to the overall thing said that they thought they were going to do more online engagement in the future. So it's looking good. Anyway, just to conclude then, really, I suppose that what I see coming out of all these data sources, if I wanted to kind of do a big picture stamp, is this. And I'd be very interested to know what you think about this. I'm going to come out of here in a moment and have a little look at some of at the chat. But the emerging picture, certainly from where I'm looking at it, looks a bit like this. You're getting sort of, I think, 4 things of particular note happening. Firstly, that there are certainly older interested audiences, some of whom have been trying, quite large numbers of whom have been trying online content for the first time. So that's where you see some of the most new engagements, certainly with streamed stuff. Also trying online collections, but nowhere near as much. And I think that's really interesting about whether or how hard museums and galleries have been pushing online stuff, their online collection opportunities, which have been there for quite a long time. But you don't see the same increases among those older audiences, but we have seen this very distinctive increase for on-demand mainstream streaming. What I think is interesting there, though, is how noticeable they have a particular interest in sort of quality brands. This is not entirely. We know that NT Live had a huge effect over all sorts of audiences, but in particular this idea that you're going to get to see something that you couldn't normally get to. So I think this has some really interesting implications for other theatres. It's like, what is it that these people are really looking for? And I think interesting for us to think about whether there is a particular niche offer that works for these people. Secondly, then, that we've got this sort of metropolitan and very noticeably for lots of organisations I know, international group of super engagers. As I say, that kind of those metroculturals that we recognise as a very particular sort of engager group, who are also the greatest consumers of the greatest variety of things, who are interested in certainly the hidden gem kind of idea, niche. They're looking for innovation. They have quite high standards in terms of quality. Some of this audience, as we know from some of the comments and so on collected, a little bit snooty about straightforward stream content. Very interested in digital first and blended. And as I say, quite a lot of organisations have stumbled across international audiences when they've streamed certain kinds of things in very surprising ways. There's some really nice anecdotal stuff coming through there. And again, we'll be looking at international users in some future waves of the digital audience survey. So something really interesting happening there. But again, very, very different interests, it feels, to those older interested audiences. We've then got a sort of younger, really, really significant, noticeable differences in the stats around younger audiences and how they're responding to digital content. So much more enthusiastic, many more new attenders that we don't just not seeing in person. They're arts interested. I'm not suggesting they're suddenly making people, that we're necessarily converting people who are not particularly interested in doing cultural stuff. But certainly we know quite a lot about this group, that they just don't turn up at those more they don't turn up at classical music concerts. That's sort of what we kind of jokingly refer to as sitting down culture. We really don't see them very much in the in-person data sets at all. But we are seeing them in this online culture data set, particularly interested in interactive, participatory, gaming-related stuff. The kind of things that sort of curate your own museum type stuff is going down really well. Digital first and blended content. Blended by blended I mean things that would interplay between what you might prepare and how you might interact with something online as well as in a live space. And then we've got this sort of fourth idea that there are distinct and excluded groups for whom we've got lots of pop-up examples of people doing amazing work, where actually digital, despite existing prejudices, if you like, about how digital exclusion affects people and so on, but sort of demonstrating that there could be another way, that actually digital can be a brilliant way of creating new pools of access if we do it in the right way. And certainly it feels as though we've seen that this issue, that for disabled audiences, some amazing opportunities, lots of really great examples from around the country about how isolated communities, in fact, despite ideas that you have to be face to face and cozy cups of tea and so on the way forward, in fact that digital can be a great way of bringing people together, particularly if you find the right platform and do it in the right way. Less engaged families, another very important group that I haven't had time to touch on now, but certainly there, the idea that that might be about using digital in very niche ways that do take into account where there are issues of exclusion to do with what platform and what tech you have available, and the idea that you might, that the creation of connecting tailored programs is going to be super important. So enough of this. I'm going to come out of there and just see how we're doing. So I just put to you really, and not on Menti.com, but just to say really, I don't know, how does that feel that chimes with your experiences and things that are happening in your world, I guess. I'm just having a look at what we've heard so far. I'm just looking at some of the comments so far. Tom, have you been able to have a little look here?
Yes, I've been watching. We haven't actually had any questions in there, though I've got a few of mine. But thank you for that, and that was brilliant. But a little bit almost overwhelming. You said in your video that you had some surprising findings, but I wasn't quite expecting that. I found the one about the people engaging with content to address their feelings of anxiety particularly surprising. Though I wonder if that's, is that because some of the older, more culturally engaged are already not at their maximum, but you see the biggest shift in people who maybe haven't thought of it as an option before. So is that what you're seeing?
Yeah. But it may not be part of their ordinary way of life and so on. And I think Sally's comment here that, that actually under 24s are much more likely to talk about things like anxiety or to acknowledge those things. It's just much more part of, perhaps who we think of as our identity and so on. I totally buy that. I think what's interesting though is that it feels as though it's an important benefit. It's an important part of. So I kind of agree. I think it's interesting, those sort of slightly quali things that you deliver up in quantitative research methods. They do lend themselves. They just kind of make you want to ask more whys, of course. But actually, still, I think quite interesting in terms of a way of articulating a kind of need that we can respond to, which I think is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and that generational thing. The other thing I was struck by was the willingness to pay, and I wonder if is that a comment on a wider societal trend that baby boomers and the Gen Xers who've grown up with NHS and that sort of idea of provisions out there, public libraries. All of these things that we accepted as part of our everyday life, whereas the younger generation coming through may be seeing subscription models as a more standard feature and just be used to pay. We think that they've grown up with this free thing, but actually, I'm not sure that they are experiencing that in the same way.
Yeah, that's right. I think that was a real surprise to me, and I think that is really worth doing as much more of a sort of a dig down, really, because I think it is interesting to understand what paying might actually mean as well, kind of thing. So I think there are so many different models by which you could do that, and I think that interestingly, we might have expected. So the people that kind of do in-person subscription look as though they're the least interested in doing online subscription. It's just not something they've thought of.
Right.
But the idea that maybe the value comes from the curatorial aspect of it is something that I think we really need to explore, because I think that's where my response to that is what I complete. I think the data genuinely is showing us these very particular fault lines around age and interest. And I think what we need to be alert to is the idea that there are some significant differences between different segments of the population. Not particularly necessarily the audience. I think we need some new segments really. And I think Andrew Chitty's just pointed out that the I2 media research, which I think is being happening in a parallel session.
Absolutely.
It's probably coming to exactly a very, very similar conclusion. So it's quite interesting, and that we're getting this sort of convergent thinking. But certainly we need to think of some new segments that respond to that are about the opportunity in the moment. But there's very, very, very distinct differences between what people's appetites are like, I think, and I think demanding quite different responses from us as well. Caroline. Hybrid business models, yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's what people are thinking about at the moment. I think that is spot on. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it feels as though no one's quite. I was talking to my partner about this yesterday. He said, "Well, if there was really a market for this, somebody would already have done it." And I think, well, is that true? Because actually, what I think is really interesting is that we we have discovered appetites and interests and ways of behaving that we just didn't know people would, that people themselves didn't know they were into. So yes, I don't know if any of you have got, I think this question about the emerging business models and how organisations can make informed investment decisions. Well, exactly. I don't know if this is my opportunity, because I kind of agree with you, Caroline. I think the problem is there is no recipe, in a sense, and this is the problem that everybody has, doesn't it? That there's no, but I think for me, the behaviour then that one might need to look at. Can you still see my screen? I don't know whether I'd love to come back to this question, but I'm going to skip over it for a minute, because I'm just going to share with you what I think that organisations probably, how should we respond to this? This is just my take on it, really. But I suppose, I'm not sure how I don't know. We quite know what research question to ask at the moment. Do we really understand what digital opportunity is yet? It feels as though it is very emerging, which is why conversations like this are really important. I certainly think that we need to, as I say, it's more than just segmentation. I think we need to go through a really focused user-centered design process with these different groups of these different groups of users. Partly because I think, as I say, we as consumers and participants, we didn't even know what we wanted at the beginning of this process. So if ever there were a time to take a human-centered design approach, I think it's now. And I think that's about working with our audiences. And I think the truth, my answer to your question, Caroline, is what's the right way to go is we have to go in a really, really experimental way. And I don't think you can do things by asking people what they want in future, because what we've seen is that they don't know. So I think what you have to do is to do things, we have to prototype and we have to test, but we have to do that in a very organized and experimental way. So I think that we have been watching the data for several years now, as some of you will know, with the concern that audiences across all art forms and types of cultural organisation, there are a few, contemporary visual art, for example, that has a younger audience and a growing younger audience, as does contemporary dance, but these are very niche arts interested audiences. But overall, we've been very concerned that the broad sweep of audiences, particularly for well-funded art forms and so on, has been, is going up all the time. That's true in the museum sector as well. We're particularly concerned that for some art forms, those audiences are not being replenished. So it feels as though there's this amazing step change opportunity for us to do something that does talk very much more directly to younger audiences. And of course, we have channels which we can be in a much more, we can talk to our users in ways that perhaps we couldn't do before. So this idea of working in a highly experimental way, testing things as we go, but I think we are just going to have a go. In a way, COVID has enabled us just to have a go at things it wouldn't otherwise have done. My suggestion is that we go from just having a go and throwing stuff at the wall to treating this in a much more sort of organized and methodologically experimental way, if that makes sense. I mean, certainly one of my concerns is that these micro business models are trying to do it on our own is not going to work. So you can hear for those larger audiences, those older regular audiences who go, oh, I like this sort of big brand stuff that I can suddenly go and see. I can imagine that for those audiences, they're not going to want to go and see everything. That if their local reps started to try and spend lots and lots of money on streaming everything all the time, I'm not sure that would speak to them. But you could see that actually, if there was sort of like one or two mega performances of all the best theatres in the country got together and made a big subscription package in that way, that would speak very directly to that. I give that as an example of, I don't think we can do many of these things entirely on our own. So that's one of my predictions, really. So Caroline's saying she couldn't agree more. It'd be too easy to get drawn into segments and typologies. Yeah, I mean, I think it's about understanding niche interests, but then having a go and making sure that we're doing that in a very kind of co-design oriented way. I think that is the only way to go forward when we are, to all intents, we just don't have the usual, the hindsight data isn't going to help us that much at the moment. We can use it intelligently, but I think the next stage to go is this very experimental way.
We had a question. Sorry to interrupt, Dan.
No, interrupt, please.
I didn't want Romany Jenkins asked a question, and and as the chat goes on, it gets lost. She asked, "What does the apparent failure to engage captive online audiences mean for the museum sector?" Well, is there any further audience data which you can dig down deeper into that.
Well, Romany, absolutely. I think I was quite surprised. I'd interested to know what you think actually, but I'm wondering whether museums were, because they knew they could open sooner, whether they didn't particularly refresh their online offerings in the same way that a lot of performing arts organisations had to, that, who had to just suddenly do something and then say, this is what we're doing, kind of. But whether it does look as though, as I say, the engagement with online collections certainly has gone down. I don't know, quite small numbers of people have done participatory workshop things, but there obviously has been quite an appetite for them. It's just that I think there haven't been that many of them. So I think, interestingly, I see some museums have just been launching some new, I just saw Birmingham museums have been just launched some really nice sort of gaming model at the moment, which sounds amazing. I don't know if it's just that they've been slower to kind of to convert, or whether the offer of, they haven't highlighted it so much. I don't know whether it's been as visible, not as much in the news. I'm curious. I don't know whether you have an answer to that, but certainly it's something that we'd like to do it in future waves. And I'm just looking, yes, yeah, I would have a look at that. I think it looks like Cam, digital first and second. Oh, that sounds interesting. I like the sound of that. What I would really love to do, if this isn't really greedy and selfish of me, is could I prevail on you in the last couple of minutes that we have, whether you would do me a favour and give me some ideas about questions that you would like to ask in the future. So if you don't mind, what I would love, we can keep talking while we do this, but just my last Menti question for you is, what questions should we ask in future waves of the monitor? Just thinking about what we've been talking about here, I would love it if you were able just to sort of jot any ideas you have about questions that the things you're desperately asking yourself at the moment, which might inform what we do next. So I'm just gonna, yes, what analog to digital bridges could be used? I mean, I think that for me, that's about, we need to sort of collect some of the things that people are doing and see. I think we're just about to do some qualitative work with people who did the digital audience survey. And I think that is one of the big questions, isn't it? And I think this idea of people doing, crowdsourcing parts of the creative process have been really interesting. Getting people involved in decision making in advance of that seems to have been really successful. Are museums and galleries stuck on the object? It's not a question I would dare to answer. What do you think, Natalie? Yeah, thanks. I think we'll leave it. We'll leave that open ended. I'm with you on that one. But yeah, maybe that's actually it has been the experiential that people have been interested in, hasn't it? And those younger audiences have certainly wanted things that felt participatory, that felt that they were able to be in dialogue in a much more direct and personal way. And I think that's true, that a lot of museum effort in the digital space has been around online collections. Not everybody's, of course, which is kind of interesting. What have we got so far? Yeah. Yes, that question about digital skills and access. In fact, that's really interesting that because we asked a lot of questions about that. And if that is interesting, we can do a little digest on that. So that is really good to know. Yeah, well, that's my passion, is the human-centered design options. I don't know if anyone's trying it, but I'd love to please keep me in touch if you do try anything out. Yeah, indeed. It's that level of interactivity seems to be super important, Sally. So I agree with you. I think that is definitely something. If we're experimenting anywhere, it feels that's the right thing to do. Yeah. Great. Well, you've still got a moment or two. I'm going to leave Menti open, because you can do that even once you've left. You can still Menti me some thoughts after this session. So I'm going to leave it open for a while. I'm not going to close it down. I'm going to leave it on long run. So any thoughts you have post session, you can add to there. Tom, how are we doing for time? We're nearly done, aren't we?
Pretty much bang on. I don't know if this was to compensate for earlier, but no, fantastic for Anne for that, and that's been just so insightful, really. And I think it's just a shame that you're session paralleled with Johnny, and I know Nile was going to talk about some of the some similar things that came up as well. So we'll have to try and find a way of getting you guys together in a different slot and say that on.
That would be a nice fun thing to do. I think it's when I quickly saw a sneak preview of their presentation, I thought, my goodness, this is great convergent thinking. So I think it's maybe it's just bloody obvious. It's one or the other. But anyway,
I think things, you know, we're now 9 months in, and things are beginning to take shape. We're seeing through the dust and beginning to see the patterns emerge. And I think you know, you've focused in on it and pulling out those same threads. But we look forward to hearing more in the future.
Me too.
Just wanted to thank you once again, and thank all of you for joining us. And yes, enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yes, indeed. Might see you there. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.